had a whole pre-place for you. So, that's it.
All right. I reckon we can go ahead and get started. And it's 7 o'clock, so I guess that's what we need to do. I don't know if the PowerPoint's going to cooperate tonight. It's being a little moody. Hopefully it'll stay working as it is right now. If it doesn't, we'll just have to do the best we can without it. Which would be just fine, I suppose. But we're in a lengthy section of Genrsis tonight, Genesis 29 through 31. And I hope if you were here last week or saw it in your bulletin on Sunday, I hope you took the time to read it, because we got a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it. I honestly don't even know. I don't know if we'll get through all of this tonight. We're going to do the best we can. My plan is to get through all 3 chapters. And again, we won't be going verse by verse. We'll just kind of be summarizing as much as we can. So if you haven't read it, do so when you get home tonight. And make sure that you're at least reading along as we're studying in these in this book. So before we dive into it, though, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll get into our study for tonight. Will you bow with me? Gracious God and our Father, Creator, Sustainer, God, we know that you are mighty and holy, and God, we praise your name and give you all glory. Father, we're thankful for your word, for every bit of it, from Genesis to Revelation, for every bit that we can learn from it. And we're thankful we have this time in the middle of the week that we can focus on a specific part of your word, study it, learn from it, and hopefully we can grow and understand your will for us, understand you as our God, understand what we ought to do in many ways. God, we just pray you bless our time together this evening, that it'll be a beneficial study, that we'll all be open to the Word and any lessons that you would have us to learn from it. God, we do ask your blessings on us in the next few days, especially towards this weekend as we deal with some potential rough weather. But right now, God, our prayers are with those in Florida who are suffering the brunt of the hurricane, and we pray for them and ask, God, that through all of this, you be with them, and in all things, God, that your will be done. Be with us always. Guide us. Help us, God, to shine forth your light in this world. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. All right. Okay, it's working so far. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Jacob's family, at least part of it. And in particular, one of the things we're going to be focusing on how his family began. We're going to be focusing on his relationship with his uncle/father-in-law, Laban. And there's a lot to get to, so we're not going to say a whole lot by way of introduction. I do want to remind us of one point before we dive into this evening. And if you've already read it, you may be aware, you should be aware of this. In these chapters, there are people who we might typically think of as heroes, per se, people who we might expect to do good things. They don't do good things. They do things that are not right. And that doesn't mean what they did is approved. That doesn't mean that they're an example for us to emulate. Again, it's just a reminder that the Bible does records people's lives as they were. It records their actions, whether they were right or wrong. It doesn't mean it's giving approval to the things that they did wrong. It's just showing us this is what they did. This is how they lived. And we see that a lot in Genesis. So I did feel the need to say that again before we dive into this, because there's going to be some people behaving in ways that they should not. And I just don't want us to think that the Bible's giving approval or any kind of making that some kind of example for us. By the end of it, I think what we'll see ultimately, and maybe the main thing to get out of these 3 chapters, is God keeping a promise, as he always does. And maybe a little bit of letting Jacob experience a few consequences of his own actions. I think we see that in here as well. It starts with Jacob's marriages. Yes, we said marriages, plural. Genesis 29, verses 1 through 30. Jacob, as you remember from last week, had been sent away from his family, due in part to his actions and his mother's actions of deceiving Isaac, angering his brother Esau. Esau wanted to kill Jacob, so Rebekah wanted Rebekah wanted Jacob to be sent away for his protection, and then Isaac agreed on the grounds of wanting to send Jacob back to Haran or Paddan Aram, where Jacob could marry someone from their own kinsmen. So Jacob is on his way, and much like Abraham's servant several years before, we read about in chapter 24, Jacob arrives in the vicinity of Haran, comes to a well. Some even wonder if it might be the same well. I don't know. Could have been, might not have been. But that's about as far as the similarities go, because everything else is really a lot different in so many ways. One of the most glaring differences, I think, is how, if you remember back there in chapter 24, when Abraham's servant had arrived at that well in Haran, and really all throughout that whole ordeal of meeting Rebekah, meeting her family, proposing marriage for Isaac, and all of that went down, he was giving God the glory. God has prospered me. God has brought me here. God has given me success in my mission. If Jacob did anything like that, we're not told about it. He's quiet in that regard. Maybe he did, but it seems to be if he did, it seems to be a glaring omission, that there is no mention, at least on his arrival and his initial success, if you will, of him giving God any glory. I think another thing that is starkly different is Jacob traveled with nothing. No wealth, no possessions, nothing of that nature. You remember Abraham's servant? He was loaded to the gills with gold and jewels, and even bringing along a number of camels, which were a status symbol at that time. Jacob had nothing. Jacob was empty-handed. And that plays into what happens next when he meets Rachel. He learns that the family is in the area, they're doing well, and Rachel shows up. She's working, tending to the flocks. She's shepherding her family's flocks. She comes out to the place where they gather to water the sheep, and Jacob sees her. You'd think it was love at first sight. I mean, he is taken by the beauty of this woman. In fact, when she's compared to her sister a little bit later on, some translations say that Leah's eyes were weak. Others say that they were lovely. Some suggest that Leah wasn't unattractive. She was pretty too, but Rachel was so much more beautiful, in Jacob's eyes anyway, that Leah didn't hold a candle in that regard. For Jacob, again, it was, we might say it was love at first sight. He loved this woman so much, and immediately was, taken with her. That gives him the opportunity to be introduced to Laban, who was, yes, Jacob's uncle, was the brother of Rebekah. Now, one thing I want to say this. I think this is a good point to say this, and maybe we've mentioned it before, that obviously we have stigmas about marrying close relatives. It's part of our culture. It's something that's been passed down for many generations. It was something that was included in the law of Moses, not to marry close relatives. But that didn't exist yet at this time. That was not a part of consciousness. That was not something that people were concerned about at this time. In fact, in many cases, it seems like it might have been preferable to marry someone who was so close within the family. That seems to be the case with Isaac and his family, and Jacob and his family, that was the preferable option, was to marry someone who was closely related to him. Again, just don't put our modern scruples about such things on these biblical characters. There was nothing wrong with what they were doing. It would be today be considered that way. It would have been considered that way even a few centuries later when the law of Moses was put into effect. But it was not something that they were as concerned about at this time. Laban even acknowledges your family. It says in verse 14, surely you are my bone and my flesh. You are family. You are of my own kinsmen. You are one of my people. And it really makes the way that Laban treats Jacob in the passages that follow as we go throughout these chapters, it makes it something that we need to take notice of. We need to keep in mind all throughout this that not only is Jacob going to be his son-in-law, Jacob is blood kin. He is his nephew, not a great nephew, not a nephew once or twice removed. He is his sister's son. So it might actually be troubling, should be troubling, the way that Laban treats Jacob throughout this whole ordeal. But then, some of that is Jacob maybe getting a little taste of his own medicine. Not saying it was right for Laban to treat him the way that he did. We have that saying, what goes around comes around. Some people use the word karma. I prefer not to do that because of associations with Eastern religions. But sometimes that is the way that it happens. Many times there are consequences in this life that we have to suffer when we've done wrong. And sometimes it's in ways that somebody does to us the very same thing we did to somebody else. That's what happens with Jacob. He had been a deceiver, a cheater, a liar. What does Laban turn around and do to Jacob? Cheats him, deceives him, lies to him. Later on, he's pretty much going to treat him as a criminal as he tries to flee. So for all of the schemes that Jacob had pulled off in the past, particularly with his brother, there was the whole thing of taking Esau's birthright. There was the taking of the blessing. Maybe other things that we're not told about. We know of those too. Well, Jacob's about to get drug along for a wild ride. He's going to know what it feels like to be on the other side of that. So, that does happen. And it's all going to come at the hands of Laban. And it starts. Jacob had been with Laban for about a month, assumedly working for him, serving, in his family as one would do. And Laban pretty much comes to him and says, name your wages. Sounds all well and good, doesn't it? Sounds fair. The way that this whole thing plays out, though, let alone the fact that Laban ends up pretty much treating his daughters as property. The whole thing, the way this all plays out over the next really 20 years, was just business for Laban. Nothing wrong with business. Nothing wrong with hiring someone to work for you, but this was family. Custom at that time in the ancient Near East. And I think we might still adhere to that a little bit today, but especially in that culture, custom would have dictated that when family was involved, it should have been more than just business, right? Laban really should have been more interested in helping his nephew. He's a young man. He's really just kind of getting started in the world, kind of getting his feet under him. I don't know how much of the situation Laban knew about. Did he know what was going on back in Canaan? Did he know that Jacob had pretty much fled for his life? I don't know, but Laban should have been a little bit more interested in helping Jacob. Maybe helping him get started. But instead, his interest seems to be more self-focused. He seems to be more concerned with, how much can I get out of this? How can I benefit from having Jacob here in the most way, with as little as, giving up as little as I possibly can? And yeah, that saying it like that makes the way he treated his daughters all the worse. Again, because he pretty much treats them as property. They're Jacob's wages, if you will. Now, it was not uncommon at that time for a young man who had nothing that he would offer to work. He would offer his labor as a way of paying the bride price. So that part of the arrangement was not uncommon. It was a thing that was done. The bride price, by the way, it's not like he's buying her from her family. Try not to think about it like that. That's kind of maybe where our minds would go, but that's not really what it was. It was more of a kind of an insurance type policy. These young men, when they married a woman, it was a very serious matter that you are, and they actually had phraseology for taking her under your wing. You are taking her into your household. You are pledging to care for her, to do everything you have to for her. What happens if he dies a year in? If the husband dies a year in? Or something happens and she has to go back to her father's house, because women really didn't have a lot of independence at that time. A woman who, no longer was married usually either went back to her father's house or a brother's house, or the nearest male relative would be responsible for taking care of her. Well, this bride price was meant to be kept by the woman's family, so that in the event that something happened, she had to come back home, it helps take care of her. She's probably going to have a hard time finding another husband in that society. Probably going to have a hard time, not going to be able to support herself in many ways. So that was to help make sure she was cared for. So it wasn't like she was being purchased, although Laban kind of treated his daughters that way. But that's not the way it normally went. He pretty much saw them as bargaining chips to get as much possible work as he could out of Jacob. And that was not okay. Jacob does serve for 7 years. He has a promise that at the end of that time he would be able to marry Rachel. By that time, he would be able to pay the bride price so that he could marry Rachel. They could start a family. But then we know the story probably that on the wedding night, and probably the best explanation for what happened is Jacob probably had a little too much to drink, which was not an uncommon thing at such feasts. He probably was intoxicated. And so when Laban brought Jacob's bride to the bedchamber, he didn't bring Rachel. He brought Leah. And again, most likely in an intoxicated state, Jacob didn't recognize until the following morning that it was Leah that was brought to him and not Rachel. Later, when it's revealed, what does Laban tell Jacob? Well, We don't marry the younger sister off before the older one is married. Well, you could have told me that at the beginning. Those would have been my exact words if I were Jacob. Well, you could have told me that at the start. And really, Laban should have. He should have been honest with Jacob about this and not used this deceptive scheme. He may have been responsible for getting Jacob so drunk because he knew what he was going to do. He wanted to make sure there were no questions. And by that point, there's really nothing that could have been done. He should have been honest. But Laban, really from the beginning, wasn't interested in being honest with his nephew. And what does he get? What does Laban get? Another 7 years of labor out of Jacob. Jacob does get to marry Rachel. He doesn't have to wait the full 7 years. They finished the marriage festivities lasted for about a week. When that was over, he did get to take Rachel as a wife as well, but he had to continue serving for 7 more years. Continue serving Laban, working for him. And presumably, he's not getting paid for it. His reward, if you will, for working was getting to marry Laban's daughters. And this is really where the problems begin. Because as you keep reading about this family, there are challenges all over the place. Over the years that follow, there's going to be strife, there's going to be jealousy, there's going to be anger, resentment, all kinds of problems in this family. It started with Laban's deception. But Jacob didn't make the situation any better when he favored Rachel over Leah. By this point, both are his wives. He shouldn't have favored one over the other, but he did. Rachel was his favorite wife. Leah, it says, some translations say she was hated. Probably means loved less. Obviously, Jacob was not completely neglecting her or completely, cutting her out of his life in every way except for legally, but it was clear that he loved Rachel more. Leah saw this. Leah was no doubt bothered by this, and God saw this. God saw it as well. And so what does he do? He opens Leah's womb, and she begins bearing children, seemingly very early on, but Rachel is not. It's kind of an unfortunate theme we see running through this family, that of a wife being barren for a period of time. For Sarah, it was 90 years. For Rebecca, it was, I think, 20 years. I don't know exactly how much time passes before Rachel has her first son, but something we see coming up again and again. And in some ways, it's worded in ways, and we're reminded that God is the author of life. And we understand how biology works and all of that, but ultimately we know that God is over everything. God, in this case, God is attributed with giving Rebecca children, or Leah children. Y'all, I promise one of these days I will say all these names right. God is credited with giving Leah children. God is, God is credited later on with remembering Rachel and giving her a son. So God, at the beginning, comforts Leah. He gives her 4 sons to begin with. And what's interesting is their names. Names had a lot of meaning in that time period. As you read there in the latter part of chapter 29, as Leah names her first 4 sons, all of them almost point to this strife that exists in the family. Pay attention. We'll read a little bit of this. Verse 32, and Leah conceived and bore a son. She called his name Reuben. And she said, because the Lord has looked upon my afflictions, or because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. Looking at her life, looking at the rivalry with her sister, she was thinking, I gave Jacob his firstborn son. He's going to love me more. Keep reading. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Apparently it didn't work with the first one. Maybe she thought this one. Now she's given him two sons. Oh, he's sure to love me more now. Again, verse 34, she conceived and bore a son. She said, now this time my husband will be attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore she called his name was called Levi. And if your Bible has footnotes, it probably has, connected with these names, what they meant in Hebrew. And of course it's related to what she says when they're born. But all of this, and then we get to the birth of Judah, verse 35, she says, this time I will praise the Lord. She does give credit to the Lord for giving her sons. I think she should be commended for that. But also repeatedly there's this idea that reflects the strife that's going on in the family. She has one son and she thinks, now my husband will love me. Well, now when she has a second, now he's got to love me. I've been hated, but now I will be loved. And apparently still that wasn't the case. Not the way that she was expecting. But it's sad, really, to see this kind of family rivalry, a sibling rivalry in the worst way, to cause so much strife, so much problem within this family, that they're naming their children according to all of these bad things that are going on in their house. So just something to take note of. And it really continues throughout this entire section, all the way through verse 22 of chapter 30, where we're talking about Jacob's children being born. Rachel, but really both sisters they're trying to get the upper hand on one another. They're competing with each other. They're basically fighting with each other, trying to earn more of their husband's love. Rachel takes the first steps to take matters into her own hands. Something that we've really seen before back with the story with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Rachel says, here, take my maidservant and have children by her. They would legally be considered Rachel's because it was her servant. That's why she gets to name them. And again, I think those names reflect, kind of a situation that's going on when Dan is born, Bilhah's first son. That was Rachel's servant. God has judged me, verse 6, God has judged me and also heard my voice and given me a son. Kind of like she's saying, I've been in anguish. I've been suffering. I've been going through all of this distress. God heard me. He gave me a son. Not the way that she had initially wanted, but she thought God had given her a son. Verse 7, Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again. She bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali or Naphtali. Wrestled with my sister. It just keeps, almost keeps getting worse. Leah, she realizes she'd stopped having children. So what does she do? She does the same thing that her sister did. She gives Jacob another of her servant, Zilpah. She gives Jacob 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Now the names this time are a little bit different. There's really no mention of the strife. It's joyful, but probably somewhere in the back of it is still the hurt and the pain that has been caused over these years. And that brings us down to this curious episode in verse 14 through 21 about the mandrakes. It says in verse 14, "In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, 'Please give me some of your son's mandrakes.' But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Leah conceived again, verse 19, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Mandrake is a flowering plant. Grows in parts of the Mediterranean region. I think there is a certain species that grows in Great Britain. And it has some unique properties. It can be toxic. Throughout history, it's believed to have medicinal properties. And there's even a long-standing mythological history with the mandrake that it's been associated with practices of magic, pagan rituals, and all kinds of things like that throughout history. And at this time, in the ancient Near East, it was believed, first of all, that the aroma of the mandrake, if it was burned and inhaled, it could cure infertility. It was also thought to be an aphrodisiac in that time, in that culture. So thinking about those two factors, one can easily see why Rachel, who still hasn't had a son of her own, a natural born son, maybe is afraid of losing her husband because Leah has given him more sons and then even gave him even more sons through her servant, can see why she's eager to get her hands on some. And at the same time, why Leah, who, as we learn when her next 2 sons are born, still feels the pain of not being as loved by her husband, why she's so reluctant to give it up. And so, what does Rachel do? Well, it is exactly what it sounds like. She basically prostitutes her husband to his own wife, which is weird to think about, but that's basically what she does. She sells her husband for these mandrakes. Like I said, not everything that we read about in here is squeaky clean. It's not okay that she did that, but it's what she did. The other hand of it, though, Leah has 3 more children. 2 more sons and a daughter. So now she's given Jacob 6 sons, and there goes the PowerPoint. Now she's given Jacob 6 sons and 1 daughter. Of course, the sons would have been more prized. It's just the nature of the way they thought at that time. But finally, after years of heartache, after years of waiting, God does bless Rachel with a son. And the way that it's worded shows God's role in in this. It says in verse 22, then God remembered Rachel. That remembering is just a way of communicating to us God knew about her situation. God didn't ever not know about Rachel's situation. He never forgot about her. It's just a way of saying God saw what she was going through. God remembered Rachel. God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Let me see if I can get this to pop back up. And again, just see the years of heartache, but then the relief that finally, it was a shameful thing at this time for a woman not to have any children, especially not to have any sons. It was a shameful thing. Finally, after all those years, and that's what she says, God took away my reproach. God took away my shame, finally giving me a son. And so by the end of it, at least at this point, Jacob has 11 sons and 1 daughter. Of course, we know the story. There's still one more son to come. That'll be sometime later on. But he has, I think it's the psalmist, blessed is the man whose quiver is full, talking about children. Jacob's got a full quiver. He's got quite a few children. And of course, that's going to go on to be, they're going to go on to be the nation of Israel on down into the future. So, it's the story of Jacob's children. Yes?
We had a real live example of the price of the bride here in the congregation a few years back. We had a man come from the country of India to Orangeburg to teach science and math in the high school. And his purpose for doing that was so that he could earn the money he needed to pay a dowry so his sister could get married.
Okay.
And then he went back to India after he accomplished his goal and got the money he needed.
Okay.
So now he and his family were members of the church, and he attended worship here with us.
Yeah.
But the dowry practice is alive and well.
Oh yeah, there's still places in the world where that kind of thing is happening. It's not something typically practiced in Western culture, though, that I'm aware of. But yeah, especially in Eastern cultures, it is still a common practice among families in that region.
I think as you finish up on that family, I think there's a lot of lessons in human nature there, like the resentment that Jacob had for Leah, and all his resentment and contempt for Laban for putting him in that trap, and that just leads to more resentment. And they ought to see it. They ought to see it coming, but I don't know, it puts blinders on folks. Same as Joseph later on. The brothers resent it because of favoritism, and you just see a lot of favoritism, which is always choosing one child over the other, as it was.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of human nature in there, and mistakes that were made, and that from that standpoint that we can learn from, I think.
And that's a lesson that, it's something we saw with Isaac and Rebekah. They each had a favorite son, and it really pitted the two against one another. Jacob has a favorite wife, and it pits the two sisters against one another, which, later on, that kind of thing is going to be forbidden in the law of Moses. Marrying sisters, and doesn't prevent them from taking multiple wives, but it did say not to marry sisters because of what had happened right here.
That's a little bit of sibling rivalry, I'd say.
I would say so. Yeah, for sure. And then, of course, Jacob's not really going to learn the lesson because, as you mentioned, he's going to play favorites with Joseph. And I mean, you maybe in some regard understand Jacob's point of view. This was the first son of his favored wife, so yeah, it's probably natural that he's going to favor him a little bit. Not right, but you would think he would learn the lesson from his own experience with his brother to his wives. You'd think maybe by the time he gets to his children, he would figure it out. But how many times have we done something that you'd think by that time we would have figured it out, and we still made a boneheaded move? But it happened. Yes.
The way it reads, again, the women are in control as far as how this husband is going to be used, and he goes along with whatever they tell him to do.
Yeah.
He's probably too tired working in the fields.
Yeah, the same way with Abraham. I think it's a good point today.
Yeah.
It says, tell me what you want me to do and I'll do it. I can see both of them saying, whoa, I'm not quite sure how to handle this.
But I mean, I guess it comes back to that theme that, I mean, really goes all the way back to the garden that, you know, men are supposed to be leaders.
Right.
We're supposed to, you know, take charge in a right way, and we're supposed to lead. And when men don't lead like we're supposed to, this is what happens.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a theme of the book of Genrsis. When men don't lead the way God intended them to, this is what happens.
There was such a big lack of communication all the way around. You know, Laban could have been upfront and honest. Jacob could have been upfront and honest.
Yeah.
You know, everybody could have been communicating, you know, what needed to be done. And it didn't seem like anybody was.
Right.
And the other thing, Leah competed with Rachel. I mean, she really struggled to win Jacob's love.
Yeah.
Yet she so easily handed her servant to her husband.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Well, I mean, but that was, you know, at that point she was thinking, you know, I need to give my husband more sons, and she thought this is the way to do it. You know.
But after 4 sons, you know, how many sons do you have to get the love of your husband?
Well, apparently, in her mind, 4 wasn't enough. She didn't get what she wanted out of it. And then again, I guess even after 6 sons plus the 2 surrogate sons from her servant,
Exactly.
seems that Rachel was still favored. And maybe it goes back to what Laban had done. I can't imagine, you know, Jacob not having a little bit of resentment toward Leah for her part in that. Maybe that plagued their relationship for the rest of their lives. I don't know. I mean, there's so many things we don't know, right? I mean, this happened, you know, nearly 4,000 years ago. So many things we don't know. We can only speculate. But what we can see, you know, how it all started. And there's deception throughout. As Gene said, there's lack of communication throughout. All kinds of dysfunction and problems. It's not a pretty picture. And it's going to get worse before it gets better.
But it's real.
Yes, it is. Thank you for bringing that up. It is. And it's, you know, real not in the sense of just that it's history, but this kind of stuff is still happens.
Human nature.
You know, it's something that we deal with still today. Maybe not the exact circumstances, but resentment, jealousy, competition. What other things could we need to? Yeah, deception, using people. That's what Laban was doing throughout this. He used his daughters to get labor out of Jacob. He uses Jacob as a cheap laborer for 20 years. So we're going to see next week. So, yeah, I appreciate that point, Gene. It is real. Again, not just in the point of it being historical, but so much of this we still deal with in different ways today.
But did Laban do anything differently that any other man in his culture at that time would have done? Wasn't that tradition as well?
Well, it's hard to say, and you may not. I don't know. You came in a little late. You may not have been in here, but with Jacob being family, it should have been a different dynamic than just I'm going to hire him to work. He's going to work. There should have been more, I guess, compassion or desire to help him out per se, than just, you go work, I'll pay you, we'll be good. That it was kind of cut and dry for Laban, it seems like. And maybe it should have been a little bit more than that. I can't speak for, other people at that time period. There are probably plenty who would have done the exact same thing. But it's not what Laban should have done.
But Jacob offered to work for Rachel. Laban didn't ask him to work for Rachel.
But Laban took advantage of the situation and used his position to get what he wanted out of the deal. And that's especially gonna, when we get into chapter 31 next week and you read Jacob's complaints about Laban, I think that becomes more clear. We didn't quite get into that tonight. We are going to get there next week. We may just break this into a two-part lesson. I've got 32 and 33 on the docket for next week as well, but I don't know if we're going to get there. There's still a good bit of this to go. So, but we will see, I think, more of that dynamic next week between Jacob and Laban. Jim and then Bob.
I think when Bob talked about the desire for money is the root of all evil. Something. This is a classic case. It's the same thing. Having sheep and animals, same thing as money. So Laban's desire for money led to all this evil.
Yeah.
And it started. It's all right to make money, but it's not all right to make money at the expense of others because you want to advance yourself monetarily. And I think that's a classic case of
for sure. For sure. And again, I think that comes out especially in the next section we're going to look at to start next week, where they make the deal for the flocks.
Yeah.
And Laban pulls a fast one on Jacob. And it only gets worse from there. Bob, did you?
It's not just money that was used to manipulate the men. The wives, Rachel and Leah, used sex.
Yeah.
Offering their servants to their husbands. It's hard to think about it in terms of our culture, but men would have a hard time turning down the opportunity.
Well, in our culture too, there are plenty of men who would not turn down that opportunity today. So, it's part of the way that God made us, not to practice immorality, but to have that drive and that desire. And Satan has been using it for millennia to draw us away from God's plan. So we're past time, so I appreciate the comments. Got us to a good stopping point. We'll pick up there next week in chapter 30. We'll get through chapter 31. Go ahead and read 32 and 33. Not saying we'll get there next week, but just be prepared just in case. See how quick we get through everything. But I think we're going to plan just to finish this lesson for next week. So, all right. Appreciate y'all and look forward to next week. Okay.
Just before we start with the